the forgotten kingdoms of Elden Ring, the lands that time refused to remember. Today, we venture beyond the golden horizons of the lands between, into territories that exist only in whispers, fragments, and the faded memories etched into ancient stone. These are the forgotten kingdoms of Elden Ring, civilizations that once thrived under different stars, ruled by powers that predate the Golden Order itself. Over the next 2 hours, we'll excavate the buried histories of these lost realms, piece together their rise and catastrophic falls, and discover why the lands between, as we know them, represent only a fraction of what once was. So settle in, perhaps with a warm drink and comfortable headphones, as we embark on this archaeological expedition through myth, ruin, and the spaces between recorded history. The nature of forgetting in the lands between before. We can understand what was forgotten. We must first comprehend how forgetting works in a world shaped by divine will and cosmic intervention. The lands between exist in a state of carefully curated memory, where history itself becomes a weapon wielded by those in power. The Golden Order didn't simply conquer previous civilizations. It rewrote reality itself, scrubbing certain truths from existence so thoroughly that even the stones forget what they once witnessed. This is not the natural erosion of time we experience in our world, where memories fade gradually like old photographs left in sunlight. In the lands between, forgetting is an active force, a deliberate excision performed with surgical precision. When Queen Marika ascended to godhood and established her eternal reign, she didn't just defeat her enemies. She erased them from the cosmic ledger, severing their connection to the Elden Ring's fundamental laws of reality. The evidence of this systematic erasure appears everywhere once you know how to look. Ancient ruins dot the landscape, their original purposes obscured by millennia of deliberate neglect. Architectural styles that predate the Golden Order's aesthetic appear in half-buried temples and forgotten catacombs, suggesting building traditions that flourished and died long before Marika's age. The very geography of the lands between bears scars that cannot be explained by natural geological processing. Enormous rifts and shattered mountains that speak to conflicts of unimaginable scale. But forgetting in this world operates on multiple levels simultaneously. There's the physical forgetting, where cities are buried beneath newer construction and ancient roads disappear under encroaching wilderness. Then there's the cultural forgetting, where oral traditions are interrupted, written records are destroyed, and the mechanisms of cultural transmission are deliberately severed. Most insidious of all is the metaphysical forgetting, where the Elden Ring itself is modified to remove certain fundamental laws, causing entire civilizations to become cosmically impossible, their very existence contradicting the new order of reality. This creates a peculiar archaeological challenge. We're not simply looking for buried cities or lost artifacts. We're searching for kingdoms that reality itself has been instructed to forget. Civilizations that exist in the gaps between what is and what must never have been. Every fragment we recover is an act of rebellion against cosmic censorship, a small victory of memory over oblivion. The lands between, as we explore them, represent perhaps the 4th or 5th iteration of reality in this region. Each previous version was overwritten by successor powers, their achievements reduced to inexplicable ruins and cryptic inscriptions. The Golden Order is simply the most recent in a long line of cosmic tyrants, though its grip on reality proves particularly tenacious due to Marika's intimate connection with the Elden Ring itself. Understanding this context is crucial for everything that follows. When we speak of forgotten kingdoms, we're not discussing civilizations that simply lost wars and faded into history. We're examining realms that were deliberately excised from the fabric of existence. Their gods slain, their people transformed or annihilated, and their very possibility erased from the cosmic programming that governs reality in this world, the eternal cities, and the sin that shattered the sky long before the Erdtree cast its golden light across the lands between. Another form of illumination held sway. The eternal cities of Nokron and Noxtella existed under an artificial sky, their crystalline false firmament glittering with manufactured stars. These weren't merely advanced civilizations. They represented an entirely different approach to existence, a rejection of the gods' dominion in favor of human ingenuity and cosmic engineering. The eternal cities were built by the Nox, a people whose mastery of astrology, silverworking, and metaphysical manipulation allowed them to create weapons that could kill gods themselves. Their greatest achievement, and ultimately their downfall, was the creation of fingers-layer blades, weapons forged from the corpses of dead gods and capable of severing the connection between the greater will and its chosen vessels. This technology represented an existential threat to divine rule itself. The cities themselves were marvels of impossible architecture. Nokron, the Eternal City, featured buildings that defied conventional physics. Their weight supported by principles of cosmic sympathy rather than mere structural engineering. Aqueducts carried not just water, but liquid starlight, illuminating the streets with borrowed radiance from actual celestial bodies. The Nox had discovered methods of binding astronomical phenomena to terrestrial uses, creating a civilization that lived by starlight, even in subterranean darkness. Their culture revolved around death and rebirth, seeing these not as endings and beginnings, but as transformations in an eternal cycle. The Nox practiced an ancestor worship that went beyond simple veneration, developing techniques to preserve consciousness beyond physical death and communicate with those who had passed. Their mimic tear technology represents the pinnacle of this philosophy, creating perfect copies of living beings that possess all the memories and capabilities of their originals. But the Nox committed what the Greater Will considered the ultimate transgression. They began crafting a Lord of Night, an artificial god designed to challenge the hegemony of the outer gods. This being would possess divine power, but remain answerable to mortal creators rather than cosmic forces beyond comprehension. The Nox believed they could engineer their own divinity, creating a god who would serve humanity rather than demanding servitude. The Greater Will's response was immediate and catastrophic. It hurled falling stars down upon the eternal cities with such force that the very earth split open and swallowed them whole. This wasn't simply a military defeat. It was a fundamental restructuring of reality to punish and prevent such hubris. The cities were driven deep underground, their false skies shattered, their people transformed into something less than human as punishment for their presumption. What makes the Eternal Cities particularly fascinating is that they didn't entirely die. The Nox persisted, their culture adapting to permanent exile in the depths. They became master assassins, their black knife techniques and ability to move unseen through shadows making them valuable to surface powers despite their pariah status. The Black Knife assassins, who would later play such a crucial role in the Night of Black Knives, descended from these same Nox, their ancestral grudge against the gods finding new expression in Marika's own rebellion against the Greater Will. The ruins we explore in Nokron and Noxtella represent only fragments of what these cities once were. The shattered architecture speaks to the violence of their fall, buildings torn apart by cosmic forces and compressed under unimaginable weight. Yet even in ruin, the sophistication of Nox engineering remains evident. Their metalworking techniques produced silver that never tarnishes. Their stone construction employed joinery methods that have kept buildings standing for millennia, despite catastrophic damage. And their understanding of underground water systems created self-sustaining ecosystems in perpetual darkness. The legacy of the Eternal Cities extends far beyond their physical ruins. Their techniques influenced later civilizations, with elements of Nox architecture appearing in structures built millennia after their fall. Their weapons and armor occasionally surface in the hands of scavengers and treasure hunters, always marked by distinctive silver coloration and impossible sharpness. Most significantly, their fundamental challenge to divine authority established a philosophical tradition that would resurface repeatedly throughout history. Ranni the Witch's entire rebellion against the Greater Will draws heavily from Nox philosophy and technology. Her use of a finger slayer blade to kill her two fingers represents a direct continuation of the Eternal City's war against cosmic tyranny. The doll body she inhabits employs mimic tear principles developed by the Nox. Even her vision of an age of stars, where humanity would be freed from the direct influence of outer gods, echoes the Nox dream of a Lord of Night, who would buffer mortals from divine capriciousness. The question of why the Greater Will felt so threatened by the Eternal Cities reveals much about the nature of power in this cosmos. The Nox weren't simply rebels or heretics. They represented proof that godhood could be engineered rather than received, that divine power could be studied, understood, and ultimately replicated through sufficiently advanced technology. If mortals could create their own gods, what power would the outer gods hold over them? This threat required not just military suppression, but ontological destruction. The eternal cities had to be erased so thoroughly that the very possibility of their approach to divinity would seem unthinkable. Their burial served as both punishment and warning, a cosmic scarecrow erected to frighten other civilizations away from similar paths. The fact that we can still explore their ruins and uncover their secrets represents a failure of this erasure, a testament to the endurance of knowledge even against cosmic censorship. The Godskin Apostles and the death of the first gods. Before the Erdtree, before the Golden Order, before even the eternal cities reached their zenith, a different power held dominion over the lands between. The gloam-eyed queen ruled through her Godskin Apostles, servants who had mastered the black flame and could reduce even gods to ash and cinders. Her reign represented an age when death held absolute authority, when the cycle of life and rebirth was not yet disrupted by Marika's imposition of immortality through the Erdtree. The Godskin Apostles were not merely warriors or assassins. They were priests of a cosmic order that predated the Greater Will's influence in this region. Their use of black flame, a type of fire that could burn away the concept of life itself rather than merely consuming flesh, marked them as wielders of fundamental forces. Unlike the golden flame of the Erdtree, or the red flame of the Flame of Ruin, black flame targeted the animating principle that separated living beings from mere matter. The civilization that served the gloam-eyed queen left remarkably few physical traces, which itself tells us something crucial about their nature. They weren't builders of grand monuments or crafters of lasting artifacts. Their culture centered on transformation and consumption, on the perpetual cycle of death feeding new life. The spiral motifs that appear in their religious iconography suggest they understood existence as a vortex, with all things eventually drawn down into destruction before being cast upward again in new forms. What we know of Godskin society comes primarily from the remnants of their religious practices and the testimony of their weapons and armor. They practiced ritualistic god hunting, tracking down divine beings and flaying them alive to harvest their skin. This skin was then processed using techniques that preserved its metaphysical properties, creating armor and weapons that could channel the slain god's power. Each piece of Godskin equipment represents the death of a divine being, their essence trapped in eternal servitude to mortal hunters. The theological implications of this practice are staggering. The Godskin Apostles didn't merely kill gods out of malice or hunger for power. They were enforcing a cosmic law that the gods themselves had violated. In the age of the gloam-eyed queen, immortality was considered an abomination, a refusal to participate in the natural order of existence. Gods who attempted to escape death were hunted down and forcibly returned to the cycle, their power dispersed rather than allowed to accumulate indefinitely. This philosophy explains much about the conflict between the gloam-eyed queen and Marika's emerging Golden Order. Marika's entire project revolved around establishing eternal rule through the removal of destined death from the Elden Ring. This wasn't simply about making herself immortal. It was about fundamentally restructuring reality to prevent death from claiming anyone connected to the Erdtree's grace. In the cosmology of the gloam-eyed queen, this represented the ultimate heresy. The war between these two divine orders must have been apocalyptic. We see echoes of it in the Godskin Apostle encounters scattered throughout the lands between, always in locations of great spiritual significance. These aren't random placements, they're survivors of a conflict that raged across the entire region, reduced from a vast army to scattered remnants by Marika's forces. The fact that they endure it all speaks to the power they once wielded. Malekith the Black Blade served as the executioner of this old order. When Marika defeated the gloam-eyed queen, she tasked her shadow with hunting down the remaining Godskin Apostles and sealing away their black flame. Malekith's blade, which carries destined death itself, was specifically designed to counter the Apostle's abilities. Only by wielding death itself could Marika's champion overcome those who had mastered death as a weapon. The temples and shrines of the Gloam-Eyed Queen were systematically destroyed, their stones scattered and their locations deliberately forgotten. Yet architectural fragments remain, incorporated into later structures or buried beneath newer construction. These fragments display a distinctively organic quality, as if the buildings themselves had grown rather than been constructed. The spiraling patterns repeat at every scale, from the grand sweep of entire structures down to the smallest decorative elements. What's particularly intriguing is the suggestion that the Gloam-Eyed Queen wasn't entirely defeated, but rather sealed away, much like destined death itself. Various item descriptions hint that she may still exist in some diminished form, waiting for an opportunity to reclaim her authority over the cycle of death. The persistence of her apostles and the enduring power of Black Flame suggest that her influence cannot be entirely extinguished as long as the concept of death exists. The legacy of the Godskin Age profoundly shaped what came after. Marika's removal of destined death from the Elden Ring can be understood as a direct counter to the Gloam-Eyed Queen's authority. By separating death from the natural order and locking it away within Malekith, Marika created a world where the Queen's power had no purchase. The immortality of the Erdtree's champions wasn't merely a gift, but a strategic defense against the return of the old death god. This historical layer adds crucial context to the current crisis in the lands between. The shattering and the subsequent return of destined death represent, in a sense, the Gloam-Eyed Queen's revenge. Even sealed away, her fundamental truth reasserts itself that death cannot be permanently defeated, that attempts to escape the cycle ultimately fail. The unnatural persistence of Marika's demigod children, neither truly living nor properly dead, represents exactly the kind of cosmic aberration that the Godskin Apostles were created to correct: the Badlands and the Kingdom of the Crucible. To the south of the lands between proper lies a region deliberately excluded from our journey, a wilderness known only as the Badlands. This wasn't always a wasteland. Archaeological evidence and fragmentary histories suggest that the Badlands once hosted the Kingdom of the Crucible, a civilization that thrived during the age when life itself was young and raw, when the distinction between different forms of existence had not yet solidified into the rigid categories we know today. The Crucible represents a concept almost impossible for modern minds to grasp. It was a state of existence where all life was one, where beings could shift between forms as easily as changing clothing, where the boundaries between plant and animal, human and beast, flesh and spirit remained fluid and permeable. The Crucible Knights, who serve as our primary window into this era, were not originally warriors. They were priests and poets of transformation, individuals who maintained connection with this primordial state even as the world hardened into fixed forms. The Kingdom of the Crucible existed during what scholars of Elden Ring history call the Age of Plenty, when the Erdtree was still young and its influence had not yet spread to encompass all life in the lands between. During this era, multiple forms of life coexisted without the hierarchical ordering that would later characterize the Golden Order. Dragons spoke and reasoned alongside humans. Giants maintained their own vast civilizations. The ancestors of the misbegotten and omens hadn't yet been stigmatized as impure or corrupted. The capital of this kingdom, whose name has been completely erased from all surviving records, was said to be a place of impossible beauty and disturbing strangeness. Buildings grew from the ground rather than being constructed, their walls alive with breathing tissues and flowing fluids. Streets shifted their configurations based on the needs of travelers. The very air thrummed with transformative potential, and visitors who stayed too long would find themselves changed in profound ways. The rulers of the Crucible Kingdom practiced a form of governance based on constant change rather than fixed law. Leadership positions rotated, not based on time, but on need, with individuals temporarily assuming roles based on their current form and capabilities. Someone who had taken on leonine characteristics might serve as military commander, while another, in a more contemplative, serpentine form, would handle judicial matters. The concept of permanent identity was foreign to them. They understood personhood as a fluid, ever-shifting phenomenon. This philosophical approach to existence created a society of remarkable adaptability and creativity. Crucible artisans could reshape matter at a fundamental level, coaxing metal to grow like plants, or teaching stone to flow like water. Their agricultural practices involved encouraging desired traits in crops and livestock, not through selective breeding, but through direct communion with the crucible energies that suffused all living things. Disease and injury held little meaning when one could simply shift into a healthier configuration. But this fluidity also created profound challenges. Without fixed identities, concepts like inheritance, property ownership, and long-term planning became problematic. How do you maintain continuity of governance when the king might transform into something entirely different overnight? How do you punish crime when the criminal can become someone else entirely? The Crucible Kingdom developed elaborate systems of memory and recognition to manage these issues, but their solutions remained incomprehensible to outsiders. The relationship between the Crucible Kingdom and the early Erdtree was initially cooperative. Godfrey, before becoming Elden Lord, spent time among the Crucible Knights and learned from their traditions. His realization that he might take the civilized brutality of the Crucible and channel it toward the expansion of the Erdtree's influence represented a pivotal moment in the history of the lands between. The Crucible Knights became the shock troops of the Golden Order's expansion, their transformative powers harnessed for conquest. However, this alliance contained the seeds of the Crucible Kingdom's eventual destruction. As the Golden Order solidified its power and Marika's vision of fixed hierarchical reality gained dominance, the fluid nature of Crucible existence became increasingly problematic. The Golden Order preached purity of form, fixity of purpose, and clear delineation between higher and lower beings. The Crucible represented everything this new order opposed. The transformation of Crucible characteristics from blessed to cursed happened gradually, but inexorably. Horns, tails, wings, and other markers of Crucible influence began to be seen as deformities rather than gifts. Children born with these traits were hidden away rather than celebrated. The Crucible Knights found themselves marginalized, their sacred duties reframed as primitive barbarism. The word omen entered common usage as a term of disgust for those who retained strong Crucible characteristics. The final break came when Marika issued the edict that officially designated all Crucible traits as impure. This wasn't merely a cultural shift, but a fundamental rewriting of reality through modification of the Elden Ring itself. Beings with strong Crucible characteristics found themselves suddenly unable to receive the Erdtree's grace, cut off from the source of power that had come to define existence in the lands between. The Crucible Knights who remained loyal to the Golden Order were forced to seal away their transformative nature, channeling it only through carefully controlled incantations. The Badlands became a dumping ground for everything the Golden Order wished to forget about its Crucible origins. The misbegotten, omens who escaped imprisonment, former Crucible priests and practitioners all were driven south into the wilderness beyond the Erdtree's influence. Over time, the region became synonymous with corruption and danger, a place where civilization ended and chaos began. Maps of the lands between routinely showed the southern border as the edge of the world, with nothing beyond but dragons and demons. Yet the Badlands wasn't entirely abandoned. Communities of exiles and rebels persisted in the harsh landscape, maintaining fragments of Crucible tradition and keeping alive the memory of the age before fixity. These settlements developed their own culture, a fusion of Crucible philosophy with the practical necessities of survival in a hostile land. They practiced a form of fluid identity politics that would be completely alien to inhabitants of the lands between, where one's role in society might change day by day based on one's current physical and spiritual configuration. Archaeological expeditions into the Badlands, conducted during rare periods of peace, have uncovered ruins that defy all conventional understanding of architecture and engineering. buildings that appear to be carved from a single piece of living stone, their internal structures more similar to organs than rooms. Vast plazas where the ground itself seems to remember the footsteps of ancient celebrations, replaying faint echoes of movements from millennia past. Temples where the air still shimmers with residual crucible energy, causing visitors to experience brief moments of transformative flux. The most remarkable discovery came in the form of the Crucible libraries, vast collections of living texts, where information was stored not in dead ink on parchment, but in the cellular memory of specially cultivated organisms. These libraries contain the accumulated knowledge of the Crucible Kingdom, including detailed accounts of the civilizations that preceded them, and prophecies about what would come after. Unfortunately, most of these living texts died when severed from their connection to the Crucible's sustaining energies, taking their secrets to the grave. What survived of the Crucible libraries tells the story of a civilization that viewed the rise of the Golden Order with mixed feelings. They recognized the necessity of order and structure, understanding that the age of infinite flux couldn't last forever. But they mourned the loss of possibility that came with fixity, the narrowing of existence from boundless potential to predetermined paths. Their prophecies spoke of a time when the Golden Order would crack and shatter, when the Crucible would return not to resume its reign but to offer one final chance for transformation, before the world ossified completely. The kingdom of the Crucible's greatest gift to later ages wasn't its technology or its philosophy, but its fundamental insight about the nature of existence. They understood that reality itself was younger than most people imagine, that the laws we take for granted were constructed rather than inherent. This knowledge, preserved in fragments and whispers, would inspire later rebels and heretics to question the Golden Order's claim to eternal authority. If reality could be shaped once to create the Crucible, and shaped again to establish the Golden Order, then perhaps it could be shaped a third time towards some new configuration. The irony is that even as the Golden Order attempted to erase all memory of the Crucible Kingdom, it remained fundamentally dependent on Crucible power. Godfrey's strength derived from his connection to Crucible energies, even after he sealed away his most volatile aspects within Sarash. The Erdtree itself, despite claims of divine perfection, showed clear signs of Crucible influence in its early growth, with descriptions of its young form including bestial and draconic characteristics that later scholars hastily attributed to artistic license. Today, the Badlands stands as a monument to the Golden Order's incomplete victory. Despite centuries of suppression, Crucible characteristics continue to manifest in bloodlines throughout the lands between. The Omen twins, Morgott and Mog, born to the very heart of the Golden Order, prove that the Crucible cannot be entirely bred out or suppressed. Every horn that sprouts, every tail that grows, every transformation that occurs represents the kingdom of the Crucible whispering through the cracks in Marika's perfect order, reminding the world that fixity is an illusion and change remains the only constant. The Dragon Communion and the ancient dragon cult, before humanity hunted them to near extinction, and before the ancient dragon cult turned their worship into rigid hierarchy. Dragons ruled the lands between not through conquest, but through the fundamental superiority of their existence. These weren't the beasts we encounter in our journey, reduced to mindless rage and territorial displays. The ancient dragons were beings of pure intelligence and elemental mastery, their scales harder than any metal, their breath capable of reshaping the landscape, their lifespans measured in geological epochs rather than mere centuries. The Dragon Communion represents one of the most significant forgotten kingdoms, though calling it a kingdom misunderstands its nature. It was more accurately a partnership, an age when humans and dragons coexisted in symbiotic relationship rather than in predator and prey dynamics. This era began when the first humans discovered that consuming dragon hearts could temporarily grant them aspects of draconic power, and that dragons who allowed this consumption could in turn share in human creativity and adaptability. The physiological and metaphysical mechanisms of Dragon Communion reveal sophisticated understanding of essence transfer. Dragon hearts contain concentrated elemental power, yes, but more importantly, they hold fragments of draconic consciousness. When consumed properly, with the correct rituals and mental preparation, A human could integrate this consciousness fragment into their own being. This wasn't possession or corruption, but rather a merger, creating a hybrid consciousness that retained human flexibility while gaining access to draconic might and longevity. For dragons, the benefits were equally significant. Their ancient, unchanging nature made them vulnerable to stagnation. Dragons could live forever, but they struggled to adapt or innovate. By forming communion bonds with humans, dragons gained access to human innovation, emotional range, and capacity for rapid change. The relationship was genuinely mutualistic, each species compensating for the other's fundamental limitations. The societies that formed during the Dragon Communion era were unlike anything that came before or since. Entire cities were designed to accommodate both human and draconic inhabitants, with buildings featuring spaces proportioned for both scales of residence. Dragons would roost in specially designed perches, overlooking public squares where humans gathered, participating in governance and cultural activities through representatives who had undergone dragon communion. Human artisans would collaborate with dragons on projects that required both minute detail work and massive scale, creating wonders that integrated the strengths of both species. The dragon cult that later arose represented a fundamental misunderstanding and corruption of this partnership. Where dragon communion had been reciprocal, the ancient dragon cult established hierarchy, with dragons positioned as divine beings to be worshipped rather than partners to be engaged with. This shift coincided with the rise of Placidusax as Elden Lore, when dragons began to see themselves as inherently superior to other life forms. The communion rituals were gradually replaced with imitation, with humans attempting to become more dragon-like through prayer and devotion rather than through genuine essence sharing. Farum Azula stands as the greatest physical remnant of the Dragon Communion age, though what we see is a shadow of its former glory. The floating ruins were once part of a vast complex that extended from underground chambers through ground-level plazas and up into the clouds themselves. Dragons and humans had worked together over centuries to construct a city that existed across multiple altitudes with living spaces, gathering areas, and sacred sites positioned to take advantage of three-dimensional space in ways ground-bound architecture never could. The architecture of Farum Azula reveals the collaborative nature of its construction. The massive stone blocks and broad open spaces, clearly designed for dragons, sit alongside intricate carvings and smaller chambers scaled for human use. The materials themselves show signs of having been worked both by dragon breath, which could fuse stone at a molecular level, and by human tools, which added the fine details and decorative elements. Some sections feature actual fusion architecture, where human structures were grown directly into and out of dragon-shaped stone formations. The libraries of Farum Azula once housed the accumulated knowledge of both species, with texts written in draconic script alongside human languages. Dragons contributed their observations of geological deep time, their understanding of elemental forces, and their philosophical systems developed over millions of years. Humans added their poetry, their emotional depth, their capacity for abstract thought, and their innovations in agriculture, medicine, and social organization. The synthesis created something greater than either species could have achieved alone. But the Dragon Communion age carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. The process of essence sharing, while powerful, was inherently unstable. Humans who underwent too many Dragon Communions risked losing their humanity entirely, transforming into dragon-like creatures that possessed neither the full power of dragons nor the flexibility of humans. These Dragon Communion practitioners became known as the Worms, beings trapped between forms, often driven mad by their hybrid nature. The dragons, too, suffered from excessive communion. Those who shared their essence too freely found their own identities beginning to fracture and fragment. They would experience human emotions and limitations that disrupted their ancient serenity. Some dragons became too human, losing their connection to the elemental forces that define draconic existence. These fallen dragons became objects of pity and eventually persecution by their purely draconic kin. The theological shift that created the ancient dragon cult arose partly from this crisis. By positioning dragons as divine and separate, the cult sought to prevent the dangerous blending that had created the worms and fallen dragons. Dragon communion was reframed as heresy, a corruption of proper worship. The communal partnership was replaced with a rigid hierarchy where humans served dragons as vassals and worshippers rather than partners and equals. Placidus Sax's reign as Elden Lord marked the zenith of draconic power and the nadir of dragon communion. The ancient dragon god king tolerated no equals, viewing humanity as useful servants at best. The few humans who maintained positions of authority during this era did so through the ancient dragon cult's hierarchical system, gaining power through devotion and service rather than through mutual essence sharing. The age of true dragon communion was over, replaced by a pale imitation that privileged dragons while reducing humans to secondary status. The coming of the Greater Will and Marika's ascension shattered this draconic hegemony. The war between dragons and the Golden Order devastated both sides, with Pharaoh Mazula itself torn from its moorings and set adrift in time and space. Placidus Sax retreated into temporal stasis, waiting for a god who would never return. The surviving dragons scattered, some allying with the Golden Order, like Lanceax and Fortisax, others retreating to remote regions to live out their remaining millennia in isolation. Yet the legacy of true dragon communion persisted in hidden corners of the lands between. Secret societies maintained the old rituals, consuming dragon hearts in the ancient manner and accepting the risks of transformation in exchange for power. The Church of Dragon Communion in Limgrave, though now ruined and abandoned, once served as a gathering place for these practitioners. The carefully preserved hearts found there, still potent with draconic essence centuries after their owners' deaths, testify to the sophisticated preservation techniques developed during the Communion Age. The dragon communion incantations we can learn represent fragments of a vastly more sophisticated system of essence manipulation. In the true dragon communion age, practitioners could access hundreds of draconic abilities, each corresponding to different dragon lineages and elemental specializations. They could shift their bones to match draconic density, alter their metabolism to process food like dragons, even modify their perception of time to match the elongated perspective of their ancient partners. What survives are the most basic combat applications, the crude tools needed for survival, rather than the refined techniques used for creation and transformation. The ancient dragon cult's modern form, as practiced by the draconic tree sentinels and other devotees, represents the final degradation of the original partnership. Their lightning-based miracles are copies of copies. Human attempts to replicate draconic power through faith and devotion rather than through genuine essence sharing. They style themselves as servants of dragons, but their actual relationship to draconic knowledge is superficial at best. True dragon communion practitioners view them with a mixture of pity and contempt, seeing in them everything that was lost when partnership became worship. The most fascinating aspect of the Dragon Communion Age is what it reveals about the malleability of species and identity in the lands between. The existence of stable worms, humans who had successfully integrated multiple dragon essences and achieved a balanced hybrid form, proves that the rigid categories of the Golden Order are artificial constructs rather than inherent truths. The fallen dragons who developed human emotional depth while retaining draconic power demonstrate that consciousness can flow between forms without losing coherence. This fluidity of form connects dragon communion to the earlier Crucible Age, suggesting that the lands between experienced a general movement from fluid open possibility toward fixed rigid category. Dragon communion represented a middle phase in this progression, maintaining some flexibility while beginning to establish hierarchies and boundaries. The ancient dragon cult's replacement of communion with worship accelerated this trend, and the Golden Order completed it by establishing absolutely rigid racial and social categories. The prophecy of Placidus Sax's return, still whispered among dragon cultists and communion practitioners, carries within it the possibility of restoration. If the ancient dragon lord awakens from his temporal stasis, He might reclaim his position as Elden Lord and reshape reality according to draconic principles. But what's often overlooked in these prophecies is that Placidusax himself existed during the transition from true communion to hierarchical cult. His return might not restore the lost partnership age, but rather reinforce the domination that ended it. The tragedy of Dragon Communion is that it represented perhaps the most successful example of interspecies cooperation in the history of the lands between. For a brief age, measured in centuries rather than millennia, two fundamentally different forms of consciousness found ways to enhance each other rather than compete. The knowledge and art produced during this era stood unmatched. The cities they built together achieved an aesthetic and functional synthesis that later civilizations could only poorly imitate. The very possibility they represented, that vastly different beings might work together as equals, challenges the zero-sum thinking that dominates both the Golden Order and its various successors. What remains of Dragon Communion today are fragments and shadows. The dragon hearts that can still be found and consumed offer only the most basic essence transfer, lacking the sophisticated preparation and integration techniques of the ancient rituals. The communion churches stand in ruins, their altar stones still humming with residual power, but their communities of practitioners long since scattered or killed. Even the dragons themselves, reduced to bestial fury or rigid adherence to outdated cult practices, have largely forgotten the age when they and humans built cities in the clouds together, the giants and the religion of the Fell God. In the frozen peaks far to the north, beyond even the reach of the Erdtree's influence, there once stood a civilization that predated not just the Golden Order, but perhaps all recorded history in the lands between. The Fire Giants were the chosen people of the Fell God, an entity whose very existence the Golden Order has worked tirelessly to expunge from memory and reality alike. What survives of their kingdom comes to us in fragments, deliberately obscured and systematically destroyed, yet compelling enough to suggest that the giant civilization represented one of the most sophisticated and powerful cultures to ever emerge in this region. The giants were not merely large humans or primitive brutes, as Golden Order propaganda would have you believe. They were a distinct species with their own language, written script, complex social structures, and advanced understanding of fire magic that went far beyond simple pyromancy. Their civilization was built around the worship of the Fell God, a deity of primordial flame whose nature remains frustratingly unclear due to the thoroughness of its erasure from historical record. The Forge of the Giants, which still stands atop the mountaintops of the Giants, serves as our primary window into their culture's sophistication. This was not simply a tool for metalworking, but a sacred site where the boundaries between material and spiritual were deliberately blurred. The flame maintained there was said to be a direct manifestation of the Fell God's presence, a portal through which divine fire could flow into the material world. The forge's construction required engineering principles that remain beyond modern understanding, with massive stone mechanisms designed to channel and focus flame energies while protecting operators from being consumed. The religious practices of the giants centered around fire as both destructive and creative force. They understood flame not as mere chemical reaction, but as a fundamental principle of transformation. Their priests could weave fire into complex patterns that served purposes ranging from healing to prophecy, from communication across vast distances to the literal rewriting of matter at an atomic level. The incantations they developed were not mere spells, but prayers that invited the Fell God's attention and intervention. Archaeological evidence suggests the Giants' kingdom extended far beyond the mountaintops, with settlements and outposts stretching down into what is now Liornia and the Altus Plateau. These communities were organized around regional forges, smaller versions of the great forge of the Giants that served as both religious centers and practical facilities for metalworking, cooking, heating, and all the other fire-dependent activities that sustained giant civilization. The remains of these forges can still be found if you know where to look, though they've been deliberately buried or disguised to hide their true nature. Giant architecture reflected their unique relationship with fire and stone. Their buildings were constructed from massive blocks of fire-treated rock, stone that had been exposed to such intense heat that its molecular structure was fundamentally altered. This process created material that was simultaneously harder than normal stone and more flexible, able to withstand earthquakes and temperature extremes that would shatter conventional construction. The techniques they used to quarry, transport, and precisely place these enormous blocks without advanced machinery remain mysterious. The social organization of giant society was remarkably egalitarian, at least according to the fragmentary records that survive. Leadership positions were determined not by heredity, but by demonstrated mastery of fire magic and wisdom in council. The most skilled fire weavers served as both religious leaders and practical administrators, their authority deriving from their closer connection to the fell god's flame. This meritocratic system allowed for social mobility unknown in later hierarchical societies like the Golden Order. Giants maintained complex trade relationships with other civilizations, exchanging fire-forged metals and heat-treated materials for goods they couldn't produce in their cold northern realm. Evidence of giant metalwork appears throughout the lands between, often misattributed to human crafters, despite the massive scale and distinctive fire marking that betrays its true origins. Their trading networks extended to the Eternal Cities, the Dragon Communion settlements, and even early human kingdoms that would later form the basis of the Golden Order. The Giants' written language, preserved in a handful of stone tablets that survived Marika's purges, reveals a culture with sophisticated philosophical traditions. They grappled with questions about the nature of change and permanence, the relationship between destruction and creation, and the ethical implications of wielding transformative power. Their poetry, what little survives, combines visceral imagery of flame and ash with surprising emotional depth and metaphysical speculation. But it was the Giants' prophecies that truly frightened the emerging Golden Order. The fire priests had developed divinatory techniques using the patterns of flame, and their visions consistently predicted the fall of the Erdtree. They foresaw that the Golden Age would end in fire, that the carefully ordered world Marika was constructing would eventually require burning to create space for new growth. These prophecies weren't mere predictions, but active threats, as the Fell God's flame possessed the unique property of being able to burn the Erdtree itself. The theological conflict between the Fell God and the Greater Will represented a fundamental disagreement about the nature of existence. Where the Greater Will sought to establish eternal order and an unchanging hierarchy, the Fell God embraced constant transformation through destruction and renewal. The Erdtree's promise of immortality through grace directly contradicted the Fell God's doctrine of necessary death and rebirth through flame. These weren't simply competing religions, but incompatible visions of reality itself. Marika's war against the Giants was therefore not merely conquest, but existential necessity from the Golden Order's perspective. As long as the Fell God's flame burned and its people maintained the forges, the threat remained that the Erdtree could be destroyed, and the carefully constructed order of grace and immortality could come crashing down. The war lasted for generations, with giants defending their homeland with desperate ferocity, fueled by religious fervor and justified fear of annihilation. The tactics employed in this war reveal much about both sides' capabilities. Giants could summon pillars of flame that would consume entire battalions, create shields of hardened fire that arrows and swords could not penetrate, and call down meteors of burning stone from the sky. The Golden Order countered with Marika's own divine interventions, breaking mountains and freezing flame through modifications to the Elden Ring itself. The landscape of the mountaintops still bears the scars of this conflict, with entire valleys reduced to glass and peaks shattered by impossible forces. The turning point came when Marika recruited the trolls, cousins to the giants, who lacked the fire magic that made the giants so formidable. By promising them status and survival, Marika turned the trolls against their kin, creating a civil war within the broader conflict. The trolls' knowledge of giant settlements, defensive strategies, and cultural practices proved invaluable. Their betrayal is commemorated in their hollow eyes, a curse Marika placed upon them that would mark their treachery for all eternity. Even with troll assistance, the war's outcome remained uncertain until the final battle at the Forge of the Giants itself. Here, The last great gathering of fire priests attempted a ritual that would have summoned the Fel God's full manifestation into the material world. The completion of this ritual would have transformed the entire region into a realm of primordial flame, burning away the Erdtree and everything connected to it. Marika herself had to intervene directly, shattering the ritual at the cost of enormous divine power and leaving her weakened for years afterward. The aftermath was genocidal. Marika ordered every giant killed, every forge destroyed, every text and artifact of their civilization ground to dust. The sole survivor was allowed to live only to tend the forge of the giants, keeping its flame burning, as a grim reminder of what happens to those who oppose the Golden Order. This survivor, the fire giant we encounter, represents the entire legacy of his people condensed into a single, eternally suffering guardian. But genocide, even genocide carried out by a god, is never truly complete. Small pockets of giant descendants survived in remote valleys and hidden caves, interbreeding with humans and other peoples to produce lineages that carried diluted giant blood. These descendants retain fragments of fire magic knowledge, though they lack the full power and understanding of their ancestors. They gather in secret to share what remains of giant songs and stories, keeping alive the memory of a civilization that the Golden Order has tried to erase. The fire monks and prelates, who worship the Fel God in secret, serve as another vector of cultural preservation. These human converts to the old giant religion maintain modified versions of fire priest rituals, adapting them for human practitioners. Their incantations, while powerful, represent crude approximations of what the giants could accomplish. The fire they summon is normal flame rather than the Fel God's transformative fire. But their devotion keeps alive the theological traditions that once sustained an entire civilization. Physical remnants of giant culture occasionally surface, usually in contexts that make their true origin ambiguous. A massive statue found buried beneath later construction, its features weathered beyond recognition, but its scale unmistakably giant. A cache of fire-treated metal showing forging techniques that modern smiths cannot replicate. A fragment of stone tablet with undeciphered script that generates uncomfortable heat when touched. Each discovery represents a small victory of memory over enforced forgetting. The prophecy that so frightened Marika continues to haunt the lands between. The giants foresaw that their flame would one day be needed to burn the Erdtree, that the Age of Gold would give way to an Age of Fire. This prediction has only grown more relevant as the Erdtree shows signs of decay, and the Golden Order crumbles from within. The very flame Marika tried to extinguish may prove necessary to clear away the dying remnants of her reign and make space for whatever comes next. The irony is that Marika's very efforts to prevent the prophecy's fulfillment may have ensured it. By making the Forge of the Giants the only flame capable of burning the Erdtree, by eliminating all other sources of transformative fire, she created a situation where the Giants' prophecy became the only path forward. The Tarnished's quest to become Elden Lord requires burning the Erdtree, and that burning requires the Giants' flame. The civilization Marika destroyed for threatening her eternal rule provides the tool necessary to end that rule. The theological implications extend beyond mere prophecy fulfillment. The Fel God's core doctrine that destruction and renewal form necessary parts of any healthy cosmic cycle stands vindicated by the shattering in its aftermath. The Golden Order's attempt to establish eternal, unchanging rule has produced only stagnation and decay. The Erdtree rots from within, unable to die, but also unable to sustain the life it once nurtured. The demigods trapped in immortality become monsters and tyrants rather than wise, eternal rulers. Everything the giants warned against has come to pass. Modern fire magic practitioners, whether they acknowledge it or not, work within traditions established by the giants. The fundamental techniques of pyromancy, the basic understanding of how flame can be shaped and directed by will, the recognition that fire possesses quasi-intelligent properties that can be negotiated with rather than merely commanded. All of these insights originated with giant fire priests. Even those who had never worshipped the Fel God benefit from the knowledge system the giants developed over millennia. The relationship between fire and other forms of magic reveals fascinating aspects of giant understanding. They recognize that flame existed in multiple states and varieties, each with distinct properties and applications. The red flame of normal fire served practical purposes. The black flame that could burn life itself represented death in its most fundamental form. The ghost flame that burned without heat or light offered illumination to spirits. And the Fell God's flame transcended all categories, existing simultaneously as destruction and creation, ending and beginning. This sophisticated taxonomy of flame types influenced other magical traditions, with elements appearing in Eternal City research and even in certain Golden Order incantations. The recognition that fire wasn't a single phenomenon, but a category containing multitudes, opened new avenues of magical experimentation. Some scholars argue that the giant's fire magic represents one of the foundational magical traditions from which all other schools of magic ultimately derive. Though this claim remains contentious and difficult to prove given the fragmentary nature of surviving records. The relationship between giants and dragons, barely documented but hinted at in various sources, suggests that these two ancient civilizations maintained extensive contact and possibly even alliance. Dragon's lightning and giant's flame represented complementary forces, and there are references to joint rituals where the two were combined to achieve effects neither could produce alone. The war between dragons and the Golden Order may have been sparked partly by dragon loyalty to their giant allies, though this interpretation remains speculative. The cultural exchanges between giants and humans during the age before the Golden Order produced hybrid traditions that neither side fully understood. Human fire monks who studied with giant priests developed techniques that combined human flexibility with giant power. Some giants learned human poetry and music, incorporating these art forms into their own cultural practices. The few surviving examples of these fusion cultures demonstrate remarkable creativity and sophistication, though they represent only the faintest echoes of what must have been a rich period of cultural cross-pollination. The political organization of giant civilization apparently included a council of elder fire priests who made collective decisions on matters affecting the entire nation. This council operated on consensus principles, with decisions requiring near unanimous agreement before implementation. The process was slow but thorough, ensuring that all perspectives were considered and that implemented policies had broad support. This system stood in stark contrast to the autocratic rule of Marika and the hierarchical structure of the Golden Order. The Giants' economic system revolved around the forge network, with each regional forge serving as both temple and manufacturing center. The fire priests who operated these forges were supported by the communities they served, receiving food, materials, and labor in exchange for their services. This created a form of religious socialism where wealth was redistributed through temple activities and accumulation of individual riches was discouraged as contrary to the Fell God's teachings about transformation and renewal. Giant art, what little survives, demonstrates aesthetic sensibilities quite different from later human traditions. They favored massive scale, bold geometric patterns, and dynamic compositions suggesting movement and transformation. Their sculptures were carved from single enormous blocks of stone, often depicting moments of change, figures caught between different states of being. The few examples that survive are deeply unsettling to modern viewers, as they seem to shift and flow even though they're carved from solid rock. The music of the giants has been almost entirely lost, though descriptions suggest they used enormous drums and brass horns that could be heard for miles. Their songs apparently incorporated the roar and crackle of fire itself, creating compositions that blended human vocalization with flame sounds. The emotional range of this music extended from mourning dirges for the dead to triumphant hymns celebrating transformation, with complex rhythmic structures that reflected the unpredictable patterns of flame. Giant medicine incorporated fire magic for healing, using carefully controlled flame to cauterize wounds, burn away disease, and even promote tissue regeneration. Their understanding of how heat affects biological processes was remarkably sophisticated, and some of their techniques have been rediscovered by modern healers, though without the magical enhancements that giant fire priests could provide. The medical knowledge they developed over millennia of practice could have benefited all the peoples of the lands between if it hadn't been systematically destroyed. The tragedy of the giants is that they were destroyed not because they were weak or primitive, but precisely because they were strong and sophisticated. Their civilization represented a genuine alternative to the Golden Order, a different way of organizing society and relating to the divine. The very existence of this alternative threatened Marika's claim to eternal and universal authority. If the giants could thrive outside the Erdtree's grace, if their flame could burn independent of the Greater Will's influence, then the Golden Order's totality was revealed as illusion. The Tarnished Kingdoms in the Age of Exile. Before the Tarnished were called back to the lands between, before grace was returned to them, and they were granted purpose through impossible quests, there existed entire kingdoms founded by those who had been exiled from Marika's realm. These forgotten nations, established in lands beyond the fog that surrounds the lands between, developed their own cultures, power structures, and relationships to the divine during their centuries of banishment. The story of these exile kingdoms remains almost entirely unknown to inhabitants of the lands between, yet their influence shaped the Tarnished who would eventually return. The first wave of exiles departed under Godfrey's leadership, stripped of grace but granted Marika's strange blessing of sight beyond sight. These weren't criminals or failures, but warriors and leaders who had served the Golden Order faithfully, only to be discarded once their usefulness ended. The humiliation of exile was compounded by its mysterious purpose, as Marika never explained why she was condemning her most loyal servants to lifelong banishment from grace and homeland. The lands beyond the fog, which we might call the Tarnished Realms for lack of better terminology, were harsh and unforgiving. No Erdtree grew there to provide blessings or guidance. No Elden Ring governed reality according to familiar laws. The exiles found themselves in a world that operated on fundamentally different principles, where death was permanent and power had to be earned through suffering and sacrifice rather than granted by divine favor. The Kingdom of Nephili, named for Godfrey's warrior daughter who would eventually return to the lands between, was established in a region of dense forests and ancient ruins. The exiles discovered that these lands had their own history of divine conflict and fallen civilizations. They weren't settling virgin territory, but rather establishing themselves among the ruins of previous attempts at civilization, learning from the mistakes of those who had come before. Nephili's culture developed a unique fusion of Golden Order traditions and the harsh pragmatism required for survival in godless lands. They maintained worship of Marika, though without grace to confirm their faith. Religion became more a matter of cultural identity than lived experience of divine power. The warrior traditions brought from the lands between evolved to accommodate new threats and opportunities, with combat styles adapting to enemies unknown in their homeland. The political structure of Nephili reflected the changed circumstances of exile. Without the Erdtree to provide ultimate authority, and with Godfrey eventually departing on his own wanderings, the kingdom developed a form of military democracy. Leadership was determined by martial prowess and tactical wisdom, with the strongest warriors forming a council that made collective decisions. This system proved remarkably stable, as challenges to authority could be settled through ritual combat without destroying the broader social fabric. To the north, in mountains that made the mountaintops of the giants seem gentle by comparison, another group of exiles established the warrior kingdom of Hora. These Tarnished had followed Horalu, Godfrey's true identity before he became Elden Lord, into the most inhospitable terrain imaginable. They chose this harsh land deliberately, believing that only through constant struggle and suffering could they forge themselves into weapons worthy of eventual return to the lands between. Hora's culture was brutally militaristic, organized entirely around the cultivation of strength and battle prowess. Children began combat training almost from birth, and those who showed weakness were exiled from the exile kingdom, cast into the wilderness to survive or perish on their own merits. This society produced warriors of terrifying capability, but at enormous human cost. Compassion and mercy were seen as weaknesses to be purged, softness that would prevent their destined return to the lands between. The kingdom of Nephili and the warrior kingdom of Hora maintained uneasy relations, trading occasionally but frequently competing for resources and territory. Their conflicts served as training for both sides, keeping their warriors sharp and their tactics evolving. These wars between exile kingdoms were fought with a strange mixture of deadly seriousness and ritual imitation, as both sides understood they were ultimately preparing for the same enemy rather than trying to destroy each other. Further south, a third major exile kingdom emerged with a completely different character. The Scholar's Refuge, established by Tarnished, who had served the Golden Order in intellectual rather than martial capacities, became a center of learning and magical research. These exiles approached their banishment as an opportunity rather than punishment, freed from the Golden Order's doctrinal restrictions to pursue knowledge wherever it led. The Scholar's Refuge made contact with civilizations native to the lands beyond the fog, establishing trade relationships and cultural exchanges. They discovered that many of these cultures possessed their own forms of magic and their own relationships with forces analogous to the Greater Will. The exiled scholars studied these alternative magical traditions, developing hybrid techniques that combined Golden Order fundamentals with foreign innovations. The libraries of the Scholar's Refuge grew to rival those of any institution in the lands between, filled with texts and artifacts from dozens of civilizations. The scholars developed new forms of sorcery and incantations, including techniques specifically designed to function without access to grace or the Erdtree's power. Some of their innovations would eventually return to the lands between with the Tarnished, introducing new possibilities to a magical tradition that had grown stagnant under the Golden Order's monopoly. The economic development of the Tarnished kingdoms followed patterns quite different from those in the lands between. Without the Erdtree's influence, agriculture required different techniques, often borrowed from or developed in collaboration with native peoples. Trade networks extended across vast distances, connecting the exile kingdoms with each other and with foreign civilizations. The Tarnished became renowned as merchants and mercenaries, their skills valued despite their lack of grace. Currency in the Tarnished realms posed an interesting challenge. Runes, the standard medium of exchange in the lands between, functioned differently or not at all in lands untouched by the Erdtree. The exile kingdoms developed alternative currencies based on precious metals, crafted goods, and even formalized debt obligations. Some kingdoms experimented with abstract value systems that anticipated modern financial instruments, creating sophisticated economies despite their exile status. Religious life in the Tarnished kingdoms evolved in fascinating directions. Some communities maintained orthodox worship of Marika in the Golden Order, keeping faith despite their abandonment. Others turned to native deities of their new homelands, pragmatically adopting gods who could actually provide blessings and miracles. Still others developed syncretic traditions that blended Golden Order theology with foreign religious practices, creating entirely new forms of spirituality. The question of why Marika exiled the Tarnished, only to later call them back, troubled theologians and philosophers in both the lands between and the exile kingdoms. Some argued she foresaw the shattering and needed warriors uncontaminated by its corruption. Others suggested she was conducting a massive experiment, testing whether strength could be cultivated outside grace. The most cynical proposed she was simply discarding used tools, never intending to call them back, with their eventual return representing an unforeseen consequence rather than planned development. The children born to Tarnished and exile, who had never known grace or the lands between, developed unique perspectives on identity and purpose. They inherited their parents' designation as Tarnished, but lacked any personal connection to the homeland. For them, the lands between was myth rather than memory, and the possibility of return was abstract rather than urgent. This generational shift created tension within exile communities, between those who dreamed of return and those who had made new homes. The cultural productions of the Tarnished kingdoms reflected their hybrid character. Their art combined Golden Order aesthetics with influences from dozens of foreign traditions, creating styles that would seem bizarre to eyes trained in either tradition alone. Their literature grappled with themes of exile, identity, and the search for meaning in godless lands. Their music incorporated instruments and scales unknown in the lands between, producing sounds that would be almost unrecognizable to those who remained behind. Military tactics and technology advanced rapidly in the Tarnished realms, driven by constant conflict and the absence of divine intervention. Warriors couldn't rely on Erdtree blessings or resurrection through grace, so they developed fighting styles that emphasized survival and adaptability. Armor and weapons evolved to counter threats specific to their new homelands, producing equipment quite different from the traditional Golden Order designs. The question of whether the Tarnished were truly without grace during their exile, or merely unable to perceive it, became a matter of fierce theological debate. Some scholars argued that grace never truly left them, but simply became dormant or invisible, maintaining its connection even during their banishment. Others insisted the severance was complete and total, with grace only returning when Marika explicitly called them back. This debate had practical implications for how Tarnished understood their identity in relationship to the divine. The native peoples of the lands beyond the fog viewed the Tarnished with a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and opportunity. Some saw them as dangerous conquerors to be resisted or driven out. Others recognized their skills and knowledge as valuable resources to be traded with or recruited. Still others perceived them as omens of larger cosmic forces at work, warnings of divine conflicts spreading beyond their usual boundary. Intermarriage between Tarnished and native peoples created populations with mixed heritage, neither fully Tarnished nor fully native. These hybrid communities often served as intermediaries, facilitating communication and trade between groups that might otherwise have remained in conflict. They developed their own distinct cultures that drew from multiple traditions, creating something genuinely new rather than simply blending existing elements. The return of grace to the Tarnished came suddenly and without warning, with golden light appearing to guide them back toward the lands between. This event caused massive upheaval in the exile kingdoms, as individuals had to choose between the lives they had built and the call of a homeland many had never seen. Communities fractured as some answered the call, while others refused, choosing to remain in the lands where they had made their homes. Those who chose to return faced a journey as dangerous as their original exile had been. The paths back to the lands between were long and treacherous, requiring the Tarnished to cross hostile territories and overcome numerous challenges. Many died in the attempt, never seeing the lands from which their ancestors had been banished. Those who succeeded arrived to find the lands between transformed by the shattering, a broken world quite different from the golden paradise of legend. The cultural shock experienced by returning Tarnished cannot be overstated. They came expecting to find the gleaming perfection of the Golden Order at its height, only to encounter ruins, madness, and corruption. The grace that guided them provided direction but no explanation, leaving the Tarnished to navigate a political and military situation far more complex than simple exile had prepared them for. Many questioned whether their return had been wise, whether they had abandoned functioning societies for a dying world. The knowledge and skills the Tarnished brought back with them represented a significant infusion of outside perspective into the stagnant culture of the lands between. Combat techniques developed against foreign enemies proved surprisingly effective against demigods and their armies. Magical innovations from the Scholar's Refuge opened new tactical possibilities. The very fact that the Tarnished had survived and thrived without grace demonstrated that the Golden Order's claims about its necessity were exaggerated. The kingdoms left behind by those Tarnished who answered the call entered their own period of crisis and adaptation. Communities that had been organized around the possibility of return now had to reconceptualize their purpose and identity. Some collapsed entirely without their Tarnished populations. Others thrived, freed from the burden of longing for a distant homeland. The question of what became of these exile kingdoms after the Tarnished departed remains unanswered, their fate as forgotten as their existence. The tragedy of the Tarnished kingdoms lies in their fundamental impermanence. They were founded by people who never truly intended to stay, who maintained the fiction that exile would eventually end. This prevented them from fully committing to their new homes, from building institutions and traditions meant to last for generations. When the call finally came, centuries after the first exiles departed, the kingdoms dissolved almost immediately, as if they had never been more than temporary camps. Yet the legacy of the Tarnished kingdoms persists in subtle ways throughout the lands between. The fighting styles employed by returning Tarnished influence those who observe them. The stories they tell of their time in exile spread new ideas and challenge old assumptions. The very fact of their return destabilizes the Golden Order's narrative, proving that Marika's will is not as absolute as her church claimed. In this way, forgotten kingdoms beyond the fog continue to shape events within the lands between, long after their founders left them behind. The forbidden lineages and blood dynasties, hidden within the genealogies of the lands between, deliberately obscured and systematically suppressed, are bloodlines that predate the Golden Order and carry within their genetics the memory of older forms of power. These forbidden lineages represent living continuity with civilizations that were supposed to have been completely erased, their very existence a challenge to the Golden Order's claim of total victory over previous ages. Understanding these blood dynasties requires tracing family trees that official histories insist cannot exist. The Carian royal family, though openly acknowledged and even temporarily allied with the Golden Order through Renala's marriage to Radagon, carries bloodlines far more ancient and problematic than commonly understood. The moon magic wielded by Carian sorcerers predates the Eternal Cities, connecting to stellar and lunar forces that existed long before the Greater Will turned its attention to the lands between. Carian architecture incorporates design principles from the Dragon Communion Age, suggesting direct descent from human-dragon hybrid lineages. The family's founding myths, stripped of Golden Order revisionism, tell of a refugee population fleeing the destruction of an even more ancient magical civilization. These refugees brought with them knowledge of full moon sorcery, techniques for harnessing lunar power that the Eternal Cities had only partially understood. They established themselves in Liurnia, building the Academy of Raya Lucaria and the surrounding settlements, creating a magical tradition independent of and potentially threatening to the emerging Golden Order. Renala's own lineage can be traced through carefully preserved family records back to the Nox themselves. Her silver hair and pale complexion mark her as carrying significant Nox genetics, and her mastery of full moon magic represents a partial recovery of Eternal City techniques thought lost when Nokron and Nox Stella were buried. Her famous amber egg, used to rebirth her students, employs principles of consciousness transfer that the Nox developed during their attempts to create the Lord of Night. The marriage between Renala and Radagon therefore represented far more than a political alliance. It was a fusion of bloodlines, combining Carian's Nox genetic heritage with whatever mysterious forces Radagon embodied. The children of this union, Rani, Radon, and Ricard, inherited this mixed heritage, each expressing it differently. Rani's rebellion against the Greater Will can be understood as her Nox blood asserting itself, continuing her ancestors' war against the Outer Gods. The Volcano Manor's nobles, though often dismissed as simple degenerates and heretics, preserve bloodlines connecting to the fire giants and the age of the Fell God. The manor's location on Mount Gelmir, a volcano that continues to erupt despite the Golden Order's attempts to control all fire in the lands between, is no accident. The founding families of Volcano Manor were fire priests who survived the giant genocide by hiding among humans, their distinctive red hair and affinity for fire magic marking their heritage. Tanith, the manor's current mistress, descends from one of these hidden giant lineages. Her devotion to Rykard and his blasphemous serpent transformation can be understood as an attempt to create a new form of divinity independent of both the Golden Order and the Lost Fell God. The serpent itself may represent an even older power, predating the giants, awakened by Rykard's ambitions and given form through Tanith's ancestral fire magic. The practice of consuming champions at Volcano Manor represents a degraded version of ancient fire priest rituals. The original ceremonies involved communal consumption of sacrifices offered to the Fell God, with the consumed being returned to the cycle of fire for renewal and transformation. Volcano Manor's version corrupts this into mere power accumulation, though traces of the original theological purpose remain in the ritual language used during feasts. The House of Hoslo, renowned for its warrior traditions and distinctive armor, carries bloodlines connecting to the Crucible Age. The family's whip-fighting techniques and appreciation for controlled violence reflect Crucible principles of transformation through conflict. The brass armor worn by Hoslo Knights incorporates metals processed using ancient Crucible techniques, methods that create bonds between wearer and equipment that go beyond mere physical protection. Dialos and Juno Hoslow represent the latest generation of this lineage, though neither seems fully aware of the significance of their heritage. The family's gradual decline from its height during the age when Crucible characteristics were still honored mirrors the broader suppression of Crucible bloodlines throughout the Golden Order's reign. Yet genetic memory persists, with each generation producing at least a few individuals who demonstrate uncanny abilities in combat, an instinctive understanding of Crucible incantations. The Redmane clan, founded by General Raiden's most devoted followers, unknowingly preserves bloodlines from the Dragon Communion Age. Many of Radahn's warriors were recruited from regions where Dragon Communion had been practiced in secret, and the clan's founding members included individuals with partially draconic ancestry. The distinctive red hair that marks the clan may derive from genetic modifications caused by consuming dragon hearts over multiple generations. The combat philosophy taught within the Redmane clan emphasizes overwhelming force and frontal assault, tactics that mirror draconic combat styles. Their heavy armor and massive weapons represent an attempt to emulate dragon natural defenses and offensive capabilities. The clan's worship of Raiden as an almost divine figure echoes the reverence once shown to ancient dragons, with the general himself possibly carrying dragon blood from his father Radagon's mysterious origins. The Albinaurics, often viewed as artificial life forms created through eternal city technology, actually represent the survival of a much older bloodline. The first generation Albinaurics are not created but born, descended from a race that predates even the eternal cities themselves. Their silver-white coloration and unique physiology mark them as remnants of a civilization that existed when the lands between were first being settled, before any of the known divine powers established dominance. The second generation Albinaurics, who appear more obviously artificial with their frog-like features and inability to walk, represent attempts by Eternal City researchers to recreate the original Albinauric genetic template without full understanding of what made it work. These attempts failed to capture the essence of true Albinauric nature, producing beings that retain some capabilities while lacking others. The tragedy is that surviving first-generation Albinaurics possess knowledge of their people's history, but lack the context to share it effectively. Latenna, one of the few first-generation Albinaurics we encounter, carries within her genetic memory traces of her people's original homeland. A place called the Erdtree, in some accounts, though this may reference a different tree than Michaela's creation. Her people were associated with silver and wolf magic, serving as intermediaries between human and bestial consciousness. The destruction of their civilization forced survivors to scatter and hide, gradually losing their cultural cohesion while maintaining biological distinctness. The misbegotten, brutalized and enslaved throughout the lands between, preserve Crucible bloodlines in their purest form. Their mixed animal and human characteristics, considered deformities by the Golden Order, represent the original state of life during the Crucible Age. Different misbegotten display, different animal traits, lions, birds, serpents, reflecting the diversity of forms that existed before the imposition of rigid species categories. Misbegotten society, such as it exists among enslaved populations, maintains fragmented memories of the Crucible Kingdom through oral traditions and instinctive practices. Their spontaneous rebellions against human masters tap into genetic memories of freedom and equality, brief glimpses of an age when beings like them were not stigmatized. The misbegotten warrior culture that emerges in places like Castlemorn and Redmane Castle represents an attempt to reclaim martial traditions from the Crucible Age. The nomadic merchants, perpetually exiled and living in isolation throughout the lands between, carry bloodlines connected to the frenzied flame and the Three Fingers. Their burning eyes and susceptibility to madness mark them as descended from survivors of the Yellow Flame Inquisitions, persecutions that sought to eliminate anyone tainted by contact with Chaos Flame. The merchants' tradition of isolation and constant movement developed as survival strategy against Golden Order persecution. The merchants' relationship with the frenzied flame is complex and tragic. They neither fully embrace chaos nor entirely reject it, existing in an uncomfortable middle ground. Their genetic heritage makes them vulnerable to the flame's influence. But cultural traditions developed over generations help them resist complete madness. The music they play on their instruments serves as protective ritual, maintaining mental barriers against the frenzied flame's whispers. Kale and other merchants we encounter represent the most recent generation of this persecuted bloodline. They inherit trauma and survival skills from ancestors who lived through the worst of the Inquisitions, but also carry hope for eventual acceptance, or at least tolerance. Their willingness to interact with Tarnished, and even share some of their history, represents a carefully calibrated risk, revealing just enough to establish connection while protecting the deeper secrets that could bring renewed persecution. The Omen twins, Morgoth and Mog, born to Godfrey and Marika themselves, demonstrate that forbidden bloodlines persist even in the heart of the Golden Order. Their horns and cursed nature mark them as carrying strong crucible characteristics, a genetic throwback to the age before species were fixed into rigid categories. That they could be born to the Elden Lord and the goddess herself proves the impossibility of completely breeding out undesired traits. Morgoth's decision to embrace the Golden Order despite his Omen nature and his imprisonment represents one response to forbidden heritage. He attempts to overcome his bloodline through perfect service and devotion, becoming more fanatically loyal to the Golden Order than most born without cursed blood. His tragic irony is that no amount of service can change what he is, and the Order he defends views him as fundamentally impure regardless of his accomplishments. Mog's opposite approach, embracing his cursed nature and seeking power through the formless mother, represents another response to forbidden lineage. Rather than fighting against his blood heritage, Mog leans into it, recognizing that the characteristics marking him as cursed might also connect him to older, more primal forms of power. His development of blood magic and his establishment of the Mogwin dynasty represent an attempt to create a new bloodline that would legitimize and even celebrate what the Golden Order condemns. The Mogwin dynasty's establishment in an underground palace mirrors the burial of the Eternal Cities, suggesting Mog understood his rebellion as continuing older patterns of divine suppression and resistance. His followers, recruited from others bearing cursed blood or rejected by the Golden Order, form a community united by shared stigmatization. The blood rituals they practice draw on techniques from multiple forbidden traditions, combining crucible transformation methods with blood manipulation principles from even older sources. The relationship between blood and power in the lands between goes deeper than simple inheritance of traits. Blood itself functions as a carrier of memory and capability, with genetic material encoding not just physical characteristics, but also magical affinities, spiritual connections, and even fragments of consciousness from ancestors long dead. This explains why the Golden Order was so obsessed with bloodline purity, why they established elaborate genealogies and prohibited certain marriages. The concept of special blood that appears repeatedly throughout the world represents recognition that certain lineages carry concentrated forms of power or connection to specific divine forces. Vari's obsession with obtaining a maiden's blood for his ritual demonstrates that blood can serve as a metaphysical key, unlocking access to realms and powers that would otherwise remain closed. The blood of someone connected to the Erdtree through grace functions differently than blood from those excluded from grace. This blood-based system of power distribution reveals the fundamental inequality built into the Golden Order's structure. Those born into blessed bloodlines automatically possessed advantages that no amount of skill or devotion could grant to those of common birth. The system was designed to maintain existing power structures across generations, ensuring that the same families remained dominant, while suppressing upward mobility from lower classes or forbidden lineages. The practice of bloodletting and blood sacrifice appears in multiple contexts throughout the lands between, always carrying significance beyond simple violence. Blood contains essence in a literal sense, and spilling it in specific locations or manners can accomplish metaphysical goals. The blood-soaked ritual sites scattered across the landscape testify to countless ceremonies where blood was used to commune with powers, seal pacts, or open pathways between realms. The question of whether bloodlines can be purified or cleansed, or whether they inevitably carry their heritage forward regardless of intervention, divided Golden Order theologians. Some argued that multiple generations of careful breeding and religious devotion could gradually eliminate undesired traits and connections. Others insisted that blood memory was indelible, that once a lineage was tainted, it remained forever compromised. This theological debate had practical implications for marriage law, inheritance rights, and social mobility. The reality appears more complex than either position allows. Bloodlines do carry forward traits and connections across generations, but these can be suppressed, redirected, or amplified through various means. The crucible incantations that strengthen certain physical traits demonstrate that latent genetic potential can be awakened. Conversely, the golden epitaph given to the Omen twins was supposed to suppress their cursed characteristics, though it ultimately failed to completely eliminate their horns. The phenomenon of reversion, where individuals born to families that have shown no forbidden traits for generations suddenly manifest them, terrified the Golden Order's genealogists. These cases prove that suppression was never complete, that the genetic memory went deeper than any purification ritual could reach. Every reversion case threatened the narrative that the Golden Order had successfully eliminated the undesired elements of previous ages. The academic study of bloodlines, genealogy as practiced in the lands between, was as much theology as science. Scholars traced not just family connections, but spiritual affiliations, mapping out which lineages maintained links to which outer gods or ancient powers. These maps revealed uncomfortable truths about the supposed purity of noble houses and the pervasiveness of forbidden heritage even among the Golden Order's elite. The House Marays, another minor noble family, demonstrates how forbidden bloodlines could hide in plain sight through careful cultivation of public image and strategic marriages. The family maintains secret practices inherited from the Godskin Age, preserving black flame techniques through encoded instruction passed from parent to child. Their public facade of Golden Order orthodoxy allowed them to survive purges that eliminated more obvious heretics. Elimer of the Briar, the bell-bearing hunter, whose association with House Murray marked him as nobility despite his violent methods, represents the kind of warrior these hidden bloodline families could produce. His combination of conventional martial skill with unusual magical abilities, particularly his capacity for remote weapon animation, derives from techniques preserved within his bloodline. The briar imagery associated with him connects to plant-based magic from the Crucible Age, when the distinction between plant and animal life was less rigid. The phenomenon of bloodline reemergence, where ancient characteristics suddenly manifest after dormancy, extends beyond individual families to affect entire populations. The increased frequency of omen births as the Golden Order weakens suggests that Marika's modifications to the Elden Ring, which suppressed crucible traits, are failing. As her power wanes, the genetic templates she overrode begin reasserting themselves, producing children who would have been normal in earlier ages, but are seen as cursed in the current era. This reemergence affects not just physical characteristics, but also magical affinities and spiritual connections. Individuals with no family history of sorcery suddenly discovering they can manipulate glintstone. Warriors finding themselves inexplicably drawn to dragon community. Scholars experiencing visions of the eternal cities, despite never having visited Nokron. These phenomena suggest that genetic memory can activate spontaneously, triggered by environmental factors or spiritual developments. The theological implications of blood-carried memory challenge the Golden Order's doctrines about individual worth and divine favor. If capabilities and connections are inherited through blood rather than granted by grace, then the Erdtree's blessings become merely recognition of existing potential rather than creation of new capability. This undermines claims that the Golden Order creates superiority rather than simply acknowledging and reinforcing advantages determined by birth. The mixing of bloodlines through intermarriage between different heritage groups creates individuals with multiple genetic memories and conflicting spiritual connections. These hybrid bloodlines can either synthesize the strengths of different traditions or find themselves torn between incompatible inheritances. Ranni, with her Carian Lajnak's heritage from her mother and whatever mysterious forces her father Radagon embodied, demonstrates both possibilities, achieving remarkable power while struggling with internal conflicts between different aspects of her nature. The deliberate cultivation of specific bloodline traits through selective breeding represents one of the Golden Order's most ambitious long-term projects. Noble families were encouraged or commanded to marry in ways that would strengthen desired characteristics while weakening undesired ones. This program of genetic manipulation extended over centuries, with genealogists planning marriages generations in advance to achieve specific outcomes. However, this program produced unexpected consequences. The inbreeding required to maintain pure bloodlines weakened them in other ways, creating physical and mental instability. The narrow genetic pool of the highest nobility made them vulnerable to recessive disorders and reduced their overall fitness. Meanwhile, the forbidden bloodlines, excluded from grace, often demonstrated greater vigor and adaptability, suggesting that genetic diversity provided advantages that purity could not. The ultimate irony is that Marika herself, architect of the Golden Order's bloodline obsession, may have been carrying forbidden heritage. The evidence is circumstantial but suggestive. Her ability to modify the Elden Ring required understanding of its structure that suggests prior exposure. Her connection to the shamanic traditions of the Numen people, her homeland, links her to practices that predate the Greater Will's arrival in the lands between. Even her golden hair, supposedly marking her as chosen by the Greater Will, resembles descriptions of certain ancient bloodlines from before the Erdtree. If Marika herself carried genes from the very bloodline she suppressed, it would explain the contradictions within her children. Why would Godfrey and Marika's union produce omen twins if both parents were supposedly pure? The most logical explanation is that one or both carried latent crucible characteristics that expressed themselves in their offspring. Marika's imprisonment of her own children, rather than executing them, suggests she understood they reflected something within herself, a heritage she couldn't fully escape or deny. The concept of noble blood used to justify aristocratic privilege throughout the lands. Between thus reveals itself as a carefully constructed mythology. Yes, bloodlines carry power and memory, but the specific bloodlines elevated by the Golden Order were chosen for political rather than inherent superiority. Many forbidden bloodlines possess equal or greater inherent capability, but their power connects to forces the Golden Order opposes and therefore must be suppressed. The question of what happens to these bloodlines as the Golden Order collapses remains open. Will the Crucible characteristics, Dragon Communion affinities, Eternal City techniques, and other suppressed heritages re-emerge now that the force holding them back weakens? Will we see a renaissance of genetic diversity as forbidden bloodlines stop hiding and begin expressing their full nature? Or will the chaos of the shattering destroy the carefully maintained genealogies, scattering and mixing populations until all distinctive bloodlines are diluted beyond recognition? The tarnished protagonist, potentially carrying unknown bloodlines from the diverse populations of the Exile Kingdoms, represents a wild card in this genetic landscape. Without clear genealogy and possibly carrying mixed heritage from tarnished intermarriage with foreign peoples, the player character might embody a new form of bloodline entirely. This lack of defined heritage could be either weakness or strength, absence of power, or freedom from the limitations imposed by carrying specific genetic memories, the Consensus Era, and the Parliament of Gods. Before the Greater Will established its monopoly through the Elden Ring, the lands between experienced an age of theological pluralism, a time when multiple outer gods maintained presence and influence without any single power claiming absolute authority. This period, referred to in fragmentary texts as the Consensus Era, or the Parliament, saw complex negotiations and power-sharing arrangements between divine forces that modern minds, trained to think in terms of monotheistic or at least hegemonic divine systems, struggle to comprehend. The very concept of multiple gods cooperating, rather than competing for exclusive dominance, seems alien to those raised under the Golden Order's totalizing theology. Yet evidence from architectural remains, ritual objects, and encoded religious texts suggests that for a significant period, The lands between functioned as a kind of divine marketplace where different powers each carved out spheres of influence while acknowledging each other's legitimacy. The physical infrastructure of this era included temples that served multiple gods simultaneously, with different chambers dedicated to different outer gods. These multi-denominational worship centers employed priests trained in multiple traditions, who could facilitate rituals to various powers, depending on supplicants' needs. A farmer might pray to one god for rain, another for fertility, and a third for protection from pests, all within the same building on the same day. The theological framework supporting this arrangement understood divine power as specialized rather than universal. Each outer god possessed dominion over specific aspects of existence, and attempting to force any single god into omnipotent, omnipresent status would violate the natural order. The greater will specialized in order and structure. The frenzied flame governed chaos and dissolution. The formless mother held authority over blood and binding. The god of rot controlled decay and renewal. The fell god managed transformation through fire, and so on through a pantheon of powers, each essential to cosmic balance. The governance system developed during this era reflected its theological pluralism. Major cities hosted councils where priests representing different gods would negotiate policies that balanced competing divine interests. Decisions required consensus, or at least majority agreement, among the divine representatives, preventing any single faction from dominating policy. This system was cumbersome and slow, but relatively stable, as it prevented the catastrophic conflicts that erupted when gods competed for exclusive dominance. Trade and commerce flourished during the consensus era, precisely because theological neutrality was enforced in commercial spaces. Markets were designated as sacred to no particular god, allowing merchants and customers of all religious affiliations to interact without fear of persecution or divine punishment. This commercial cosmopolitanism fostered cultural exchange and innovation, with ideas and techniques from different religious traditions freely mixing and producing syntheses. The artistic achievements of this period demonstrate remarkable sophistication in navigating multiple theological frameworks simultaneously. A single sculpture might incorporate symbolism from 4 or 5 different divine traditions, arranged in ways that honored each without subordinating any to the others. Architecture integrated design principles from competing theological schools, creating buildings that functioned as physical manifestations of divine cooperation. The educational system trained scholars in comparative theology, with students expected to master the basic principles of at least 3 or 4 divine traditions before specializing. This created an intellectual class capable of moving fluidly between different religious communities, serving as translators and mediators when conflicts arose. The greatest scholars of the age were those who could find creative solutions that satisfied multiple gods' requirements simultaneously. Military conflict during the consensus era operated under elaborate rules meant to prevent divine intervention from escalating disputes beyond mortal capacity to manage. Armies fighting on behalf of nations allied with different gods were prohibited from invoking divine aid beyond certain carefully defined limits. Violations of these rules could bring censure from the entire parliament of gods, effectively forcing the offending nation to stand down or face combined divine opposition. The mechanisms through which gods communicated and negotiated with each other remain mysterious. Some sources suggest they met in a realm outside normal space and time, a neutral ground where their avatars or representatives could interact without triggering the catastrophic conflicts that would result from their full essences meeting. Others propose they communicated through elaborate rituals performed by their high priests, with divine will being discerned through complex interpretative techniques. The breakdown of the consensus came gradually rather than through a single dramatic event. The greater will's influence in the lands between increased slowly as it demonstrated superior capacity for ordering reality and providing benefits to its worshippers. Communities that adopted greater will worship exclusively enjoyed advantages in agriculture, military success, and social stability that made other divine patrons seem less effective by comparison. This created a feedback loop where success attracted more worshippers, which granted the greater will more influence, which enabled it to provide even greater benefits to its followers. The theological marketplace that had supported pluralism became distorted as one option dominated increasingly. Other gods found their follower bases eroding as pragmatic populations shifted allegiance to whichever power delivered the most tangible results. The critical moment came when Marika offered to serve as exclusive vessel for the greater will in exchange for its full commitment to the lands between. This arrangement violated the fundamental principle of the consensus era, that no single god should claim totality of influence. But Marika argued persuasively that the consensus system had become unstable, that the greater will's growing dominance was inevitable, and that formally recognizing this reality would be better than allowing the situation to deteriorate into open conflict. The other outer gods, recognizing they lacked the power to prevent the greater will's ascension, negotiated terms for their continued existence rather than fighting a battle they would lose. Some, like the frenzied flame and the formless mother, were granted limited spheres where they could maintain influence. Others, like the fell god, were suppressed entirely and sealed away. Still others, whose names have been lost entirely, chose withdrawal over subordination, departing the lands between for other realms. The physical infrastructure of the consensus era was systematically destroyed or repurposed during the Golden Order's consolidation. Multi-denominational temples were converted to exclusive greater will worship or demolished entirely. Texts describing the parliament system were burned or locked away in forgotten archives. Scholars trained in comparative theology were pressured to abandon their pluralistic thinking and embrace Golden Order orthodoxy exclusively. Yet complete erasure proved impossible. The population's memory of religious choice persisted, creating persistent resistance to Golden Order totality. Secret worship of suppressed gods continued in hidden locations, preserving fragments of old rituals and keeping alive the possibility of theological alternatives. The very need for such thorough suppression demonstrated that the consensus era's legacy remained a threat to Golden Order authority. The architecture of Lanedale itself contains traces of the consensus era, buried beneath Golden Order construction. Deep in the sewers and forgotten chambers, careful archaeological work reveals earlier temple layers dedicated to gods whose names the Golden Order tried to erase. Some of these pre-existing sacred spaces were incorporated into Erdtree Cathedral and other major Golden Order structures. The new religion quite literally built on top of the old pluralistic system. The question of whether the consensus era represented genuine divine cooperation or merely a temporary truce in an eternal cosmic war divides scholars who dare study this period. Optimists argue it demonstrated that even gods could negotiate and compromise when necessity demanded. Pessimists contend it was always unstable, that divine nature inherently tends toward conflict and dominance, making the parliament system a brief aberration rather than a sustainable model. The theological implications of the consensus era extend to questions about the nature of divinity itself. If multiple gods could coexist and share authority, does that mean divine power is limited and specialized rather than absolute? If gods needed to negotiate with each other, does that imply they are bound by rules and limitations rather than being truly omnipotent? These questions threaten the Golden Order's entire theological framework, which required the greater will to be understood as supreme and unchallenged. Some heretical scholars proposed that the greater will itself was born during the consensus era, that it emerged from the cooperation of multiple older divine forces who combined their essences to create a more powerful unified entity. This theory, if true, would mean the Golden Order's God is actually a synthetic construction rather than an eternal primordial force. The vehemence with which Golden Order authorities suppress this theory suggests they consider it particularly dangerous. The artifacts surviving from the consensus era often possess unusual properties that don't fit neatly into any single school of magic or divine tradition. A single talisman might channel both frenzied flame chaos and greater will order These hybrid objects demonstrate that the boundaries between different divine powers were once more permeable, that synthesis was possible in ways that later rigid categorization made impossible. The prayers and incantations preserved from this period often invoke multiple gods in sequence or even simultaneously, requesting that their combined power accomplish what no single god could achieve alone. These cooperative invocations require precise timing and intonation to prevent the conflicting divine energies from canceling each other out or triggering destructive resonances. Modern practitioners attempting to revive these techniques often fail catastrophically, lacking the training necessary to balance multiple divine forces. The political philosophy of the consensus era influenced governance structures that persisted long after the theological pluralism ended. The concept that power should be distributed rather than concentrated, that different spheres of authority should check and balance each other, that decision-making should involve negotiation between competing interests. All these principles derive from observing how the gods themselves once organized their authority. The Golden Order's centralization represented a rejection of these principles, but their memory persisted in resistance movements and alternative political proposals. The breakdown of the consensus didn't happen uniformly across the lands between. Some regions maintained pluralistic worship for decades or even centuries after Marika's ascension, existing as theological holdouts against the advancing Golden Order. These areas were gradually conquered, converted, or isolated, but for a time they preserved living examples of how the old system functioned. The last of these holdout regions, whose location has been deliberately obscured in official records, reportedly survived until shortly before the shattering. The question of whether the consensus era could be restored, whether the lands between might return to theological pluralism after the Golden Order's collapse, animates much of the underground religious discourse. Different factions advancing different gods as alternatives to the greater will often fail to recognize they might all coexist if they adopted consensus principles rather than seeking to replace one monopoly with another. The shattering itself, viewed through the lens of consensus-era history, might represent not the unprecedented catastrophe official narratives claim, but rather a return to theological pluralism through violent means. The various demigods and their divine patrons competing for control recapitulate the pre-consensus conflicts that originally necessitated the parliament system. The question becomes whether a new consensus could emerge from current chaos, or whether the age of divine cooperation is permanently past. The legacy of the consensus era thus represents both hope and warning. It demonstrates that theological pluralism is possible, that even gods can cooperate when circumstances demand. But it also reveals the instability inherent in such arrangements, the tendency for stronger powers to eventually dominate weaker ones, the difficulty of maintaining balance once advantages begin accruing to any single faction. Whether this legacy will influence whatever order emerges from the current crisis remains to be seen. Conclusion: memory against oblivion. We've journeyed through ruins and legends, piecing together fragments of civilizations that were supposed to stay forgotten. The eternal cities with their god-killing ambitions, the Godskin Age when death held absolute authority, the Kingdom of the Crucible, where all life was one, the Dragon Communion era of partnership between species, the giant civilization of transformative flame, the tarnished kingdoms beyond the fog, the forbidden bloodlines carrying ancestral memory, the consensus era, when gods learned to share power. Each of these forgotten kingdoms represents not just a lost culture, but a lost possibility, an alternative way of organizing existence that the Golden Order had to destroy to claim totality. What becomes clear through this archaeological excavation is that forgetting in the lands between is never natural or complete. Reality itself resists erasure, preserving traces in geology, genetics, and the stubborn persistence of ideas that refuse to die. Every ruin we explore, every ancient technique rediscovered, every bloodline that refuses to breed true to Golden Order standards represents a small victory of memory against the cosmic censorship that would prefer these truths remain buried. The lands between we explore in our journey are palimpsests, parchments that have been written on, scraped clean and written on again repeatedly. But the previous texts never completely disappear. They bleed through, creating confusing overlaps where multiple histories occupy the same space. The Golden Order tried to make itself appear eternal and inevitable, but everywhere we look, we find evidence of the contingency, of the specific choices and violent suppressions that created current conditions. These forgotten kingdoms matter not just as history, but as potential. They demonstrate that the world can be organized differently, that gods can be challenged or even killed, that species boundaries are artificial, that fire can serve purposes other than those the Golden Order permits. Every alternative way of being that once existed and was suppressed represents a possibility that could be recovered or reinvented. The past is prologue to futures the present has tried to foreclose. The question of what comes after the Golden Order's collapse cannot be answered without understanding what came before its rise. The civilizations we've examined offer models and warnings, examples of both what might be aspired to and what should be avoided. The Eternal City's hubris, the Godskin's single-minded focus on death, the Crucible's unsustainable fluidity, the Giant's inflexibility, the Consensus's instability, all of these contain lessons for those who would build something new from the shattering's rubble. Perhaps most importantly, these forgotten kingdoms remind us that the cosmic laws we take for granted are actually relatively recent constructs. The Elden Ring has been modified repeatedly to serve the purposes of those powerful enough to reshape it. Death was removable, species were malleable, divine power could be engineered or shared. Reality itself is younger and more plastic than the Golden Order's rhetoric of eternal, unchanging truth would have us believe. As you continue your journey through the lands between, remember that you walk on ground that has supported countless civilizations, each believing itself eternal, each eventually buried beneath the ambitions of its successors. The ruins you explore are monuments to impermanence, proof that no order lasts forever, no matter how thoroughly it tries to erase alternatives. The Forgotten Kingdoms whisper through every stone and bloodline, waiting for someone to remember their truths, and perhaps apply their lessons to whatever comes next. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the Forgotten Kingdoms and lost possibilities of Elden Ring's world, consider leaving a like and subscribing for more explorations of gaming's deepest mysteries and most carefully hidden lore. Fellow seekers of truth, until next time, may you find fragments of forgotten wisdom in unexpected places, and may your memory prove stronger than any god's censorship.